Margaret Wilson adjusted her simple blue dress as she sat in the folding chair on the parade grounds of the Marine Corps Base Quantico. At 58, with silver streaks through her dark brown hair, she looked like any other proud mother attending her son's graduation from officer candidate school. She clutched her small purse in her lap, eyes fixed on the empty stage, where soon her only child, Michael, would receive his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. "Excited?" asked the woman next to her, who had introduced herself as Cheryl Dawson, mother of another candidate. "Very," Margaret nodded, offering a polite smile. "It's been a long journey." "Tell me about it." 24 weeks of barely hearing from my David. "My husband served in the Army, but I never understood how hard military training could be until David started sending those short, exhausted letters." Margaret just nodded again. She understood more than Cheryl could know. "Are you here alone?" Cheryl asked, noticing the empty seat beside Margaret. "Yes, Michael's father passed away 10 years ago." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Was he military too?" Margaret paused briefly. "No, Richard was a high school history teacher." Before Cheryl could ask more questions, the Marine Corps band began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. Margaret sat up straighter, her eyes scanning the formation of young officer candidates marching onto the field in perfect unison. She quickly spotted Michael in the second row, tall like his father, with the same determined set to his jaw that she recognized from her own reflection. The morning sun glinted off the brass buttons of their uniforms as they came to a halt in precise formation. Margaret felt a swell of pride mixed with a familiar ache. She had supported Michael's decision to join the Marines, but it had stirred memories she'd worked hard to keep buried for over 30 years. Colonel James Barrett, the commanding officer of Officer Candidates School, approached the podium. His voice boomed across the parade grounds as he welcomed the families and distinguished guests. Margaret listened politely, her focus mainly on Michael, who stood at rigid attention. "Today, we add 76 new officers to the proud legacy of the United States Marine Corps," Colonel Barrett announced. "These men and women have proven their mettle through months of intensive training, both physical and mental." As the colonel continued, an older man in a Marine Corps uniform with 3 stars on each shoulder took a seat in the front row of the viewing stand. From her position in the family section, Margaret recognized him immediately despite the decades that had passed. General Thomas Harrington, now the Commandant of the Marine Corps, had changed little beyond the gray at his temples and the additional stars on his collar. Margaret's hands tightened around her purse. She hadn't expected him to be here. Generals, even the Commandant, didn't typically attend regular OCS graduations. She slid slightly lower in her seat, though she knew it was unlikely he would notice her among the hundreds of family members. After Colonel Barrett finished his remarks, he introduced General Harrington, who would deliver the commencement address. The Commandant approached the podium with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. His voice carried across the parade grounds as he spoke about duty, honor, and the responsibilities of leadership. "The title of Marine officer is not given, it is earned," he told the candidates. "And once earned, it must be re-earned every day through your actions and decisions." Margaret found herself nodding slightly. Some lessons never changed. The Commandant's speech was brief but powerful. As he concluded, he announced, "As is our tradition, before these candidates take their oath and receive their commissions, I would like to recognize those among us who have previously served our nation in uniform. Would all veterans in the audience please stand and be recognized?" Throughout the audience, men and women of various ages rose to their feet. Most were older, parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts of the graduates. Some wore caps or jackets identifying their branch of service. Margaret remained seated, her eyes fixed on her son. Cheryl nudged her gently. "Aren't you going to stand?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I—" "Come now," Cheryl insisted, misunderstanding. "Even if you just served briefly, you should be proud." Before Margaret could respond, General Harrington was speaking again. "On behalf of a grateful nation, we thank you for your service. Please remain standing while we recognize those who have made the ultimate sacrifice." The band began playing a somber rendition of Taps. Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat, memories flooding back that she couldn't push away. Without conscious thought, her right hand moved to touch the small, barely noticeable scar near her left collarbone. As the final notes faded away, the Commandant asked the veterans to be seated. The ceremony continued with the administration of the oath of office. Row by row, the candidates stepped forward to receive their commissions. Second Lieutenant Michael Wilson, the announcer finally called. Margaret watched with misty eyes as her son stepped forward to receive his commission. Colonel Barrett shook his hand, and then Michael turned to face the Commandant. Something unexpected happened. General Harrington paused, looking more closely at Michael. He said something that the microphones didn't catch, and Michael responded. The Commandant's head turned slightly, his eyes scanning the family section until they found Margaret. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes locked across the parade ground. 30 years fell away in an instant. Margaret saw recognition dawn on the Commandant's face, confusion, then disbelief, then certainty. Michael returned to his position in formation, unaware of the silent exchange that had just occurred. The ceremony continued, but Margaret barely heard it. Her mind was racing. She had come here today for one reason only, to watch her son graduate, to be the proud, ordinary mother of a new Marine officer. But as the ceremony concluded, and the audience rose for the Marine Corps hymn, Margaret knew that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to end. The Commandant had recognized her, and judging by the way he kept glancing in her direction, this day was about to become about much more than her son's graduation. The ceremony concluded with the traditional dismissal of the newly commissioned officers, who broke formation to greet their waiting families. The parade grounds quickly filled with happy reunions, proud parents embracing their sons and daughters in uniform. Margaret stood searching for Michael among the crowd. She spotted him making his way toward her, his new gold bars gleaming on his shoulders, a broad smile on his face. "Mom," he called, breaking into an uncharacteristic grin as he reached her. Protocol forgotten, he wrapped her in a tight hug. "I did it." "Yes, you did," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Michael." As they embraced, Margaret noticed a Marine officer approaching them. She recognized him as Colonel Barrett's aide. "Lieutenant Wilson," the aide addressed Michael. "Congratulations on your commission, sir." "Thank you," Michael replied, standing a bit straighter. "The Commandant would like to speak with you and your mother. If you'd both follow me, please." Michael looked surprised, then concerned. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all, sir. The Commandant often speaks with selected new officers and their families after graduation. It's an honor." Margaret knew better. This was no routine meeting. She could feel curious eyes on them as the aide led them away from the crowd, toward the administration building adjacent to the parade grounds. "Mom, did you ever meet the Commandant before?" Michael asked quietly as they walked. "It was a long time ago," Margaret replied evasively. "Before you were born." Michael gave her a curious look, but didn't press further as they entered the building and were led to a conference room. Inside, General Harrington stood looking out the window, his cover tucked under his arm. He turned as they entered. "Lieutenant Wilson, congratulations," the Commandant said, extending his hand to Michael. "Thank you, sir," Michael replied, shaking the offered hand firmly. Then the general turned to Margaret. His eyes held a mixture of emotions, surprise, respect, and something more complex. "It's been a long time." "Ma'am," he said, the slight hesitation before the honorific speaking volumes. The way he said, "ma'am," with that particular inflection, with that knowing look, carried decades of history. It wasn't the generic term of respect for a civilian woman. It was the address one gives to a superior officer. Michael's head swiveled between them, confusion evident on his face. "Yes, it has been, General," Margaret responded evenly. 32 years, I believe." "You two know each other?" Michael asked, looking from his mother to the Commandant and back again. General Harrington gestured to the chairs around the conference table. "Please, sit down. Lieutenant Wilson, I believe there's a part of your mother's history you may not be familiar with." As they sat, Margaret felt a strange mix of dread and relief. For decades, she had kept her past compartmentalized, separated from her life as a mother and small-town librarian in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Now those walls were crumbling. "Mom," Michael prompted, his expression concerned and confused. Margaret took a deep breath. "Michael, before I met your father, before I became a librarian, I served in the Marine Corps." Michael's eyes widened. "You were a Marine, why didn't you ever tell me?" "It's more complicated than that," the Commandant interjected gently. Your mother wasn't just any Marine, he looked at Margaret. Would you prefer to tell him, or shall I? Margaret straightened in her chair, a glimmer of her old bearing returning. I was an officer, Michael. I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1989 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, just like you today. Michael stared at her in disbelief. You went to Annapolis? You were a Marine officer. How could you not tell me this, especially when I decided to join? I had my reasons, Margaret said quietly. After I left the Corps, I wanted to leave that part of my life behind. Your mother is being modest, General Harrington said. Lieutenant Margaret Foster, as she was then, was one of the first female officers assigned to what we now call Marine Special Operations. This was before women were officially allowed in combat roles. On paper, she was an intelligence officer. In reality, she was part of a classified program testing the integration of female operators in special units. Michael's jaw dropped. He looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet, bookish woman who had raised him single-handedly after his father's death, who had fussed over his scraped knees and helped with his homework, had once been a Marine special operator. In 1993, the general continued, your mother's unit was deployed as part of Operation Gothic Serpent in Somalia. Michael's eyes widened further. He knew his military history. That was Mogadishu, Margaret said softly. Yes. The memories she had kept locked away came flooding back. The stifling heat, the narrow streets, the sound of gunfire echoing off buildings. Her four-person team had been tasked with intelligence gathering and close-quarters battle inside the city, supporting the larger operation to capture warlord lieutenants. What happened? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, looking at General Harrington. Some aspects of that operation remained classified, even decades later. Your mother's unit was separated from the main force when the situation deteriorated, the general explained carefully. They held their position for 18 hours, protecting wounded Rangers until extraction was possible. What he didn't say, what the carefully sanitized official report didn't reveal, was how Margaret had taken command after her team leader was killed. How she had coordinated their defense, treated the wounded with limited supplies, and ultimately led a nighttime movement through enemy-controlled streets to reach a secondary extraction point. I was a captain then, the general continued. I led one of the QRF units sent in to assist with extraction. That's how I first met your mother. He looked at Margaret with undisguised respect. She was the most composed officer I'd encountered in that chaos, despite being wounded herself. Michael turned to his mother. You were wounded in combat. Margaret's hand unconsciously moved to the scar near her collarbone. It wasn't serious, a bullet fragment. Not serious, General Harrington shook his head. Lieutenant Foster, I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, received the Silver Star for her actions that day. One of the first women to receive it for direct combat action, though the citation was worded carefully given the policies at the time. Michael looked stunned. A Silver Star? Mom, why would you hide this? Margaret's eyes dropped to her hands, folded in her lap. After Somalia, I wasn't the same. None of us were. What was supposed to be a straightforward mission became something else entirely. She paused. I completed my commitment to the Corps, but when my service was up in 1995, I decided not to re-enlist. I wanted a different life. What she didn't say was how the nightmares had plagued her, how the loss of her team members had weighed on her, how she had sought the quiet predictability of civilian life as an antidote to the chaos and loss she had experienced. I met your father a year later, she continued. He was kind, stable, intellectual, everything that represented the new life I wanted. When he proposed, I accepted on one condition, that my military service would remain in the past. He agreed. But why keep it from me? Michael asked, hurt evident in his voice. At first, you were too young to understand. Later, Margaret sighed. Later, I worried that knowing might influence you toward a path that had caused me pain. When you decided to join the Marines anyway, I didn't want to burden you with my experiences. I wanted you to find your own way, make your own choices without the shadow of my service hanging over you. General Harrington cleared his throat. Lieutenant Wilson, I hope you understand what an extraordinary legacy you're carrying forward. Your mother exemplified the best qualities of a Marine officer: courage, leadership, sacrifice. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing everything he had learned. All those times I talked about joining the Marines, about wanting to serve. You never said anything." "I listened," Margaret replied. "I made sure you understood the realities of service as best I could without revealing my past. I wanted your decision to be yours alone." "When I recognized your name during the ceremony," the Commandant explained, "I couldn't believe the coincidence. Then I saw your mother in the audience, and despite the years, I knew immediately. Some people you don't forget." Michael turned to the general. "Sir, how many people know about my mother's service?" "The full details? Very few. The program she was part of wasn't officially acknowledged until years later. Her Silver Star citation is public record, but the specific circumstances remain classified." The general hesitated. "Lieutenant Wilson, I hope you understand why I felt you needed to know this today. You're carrying on a proud legacy, one that includes your mother's service." Michael nodded slowly, still trying to reconcile the mother he knew with the Marine officer he was just learning about. Margaret reached out to touch her son's hand. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Perhaps that was wrong of me, but please understand I never wanted my past to shape your future." As Michael looked into his mother's eyes, he began to see her differently, not just as the woman who had raised him, but as someone who had faced challenges he was only beginning to understand. "I think," the Commandant said gently, "you two have a lot to talk about. Lieutenant Wilson, you're not due to report to the basic school for 3 weeks, correct?" "Yes, sir," Michael confirmed. "Good, take that time." General Harrington stood. "Mrs. Wilson, ma'am, it's been an honor to see you again. The Corps has never forgotten your service, even if you chose to leave it behind." As they prepared to leave, Michael turned to his mother with new eyes. The quiet librarian from Iowa suddenly seemed taller, her bearing more purposeful. The woman who had only come to watch her son graduate had become someone else entirely, someone with a history of courage and sacrifice he was just beginning to comprehend. The drive back to their hotel was quiet. Michael sat in the passenger seat of his mother's modest sedan, still in his dress blues, occasionally glancing at Margaret as if trying to reconcile the woman driving with the Marine officer he'd just learned about. "You have questions," Margaret finally said, breaking the silence as they pulled into the hotel parking lot. "About 1,000,000, Michael admitted. Once in their hotel room, Margaret carefully hung up her blue dress while Michael changed out of his uniform. When they were both in more comfortable clothes, they sat across from each other at the small table near the window. "Start at the beginning," Michael said. "Please, I want to understand." Margaret took a deep breath. "I grew up in a military family. Your grandfather, my father, was a career Marine. He served in Vietnam 2 tours. My brother joined the Corps straight out of high school. It seemed natural that I would follow." "But you went to Annapolis. That's not easy to get into." A small smile touched Margaret's lips. "I was stubborn and good at math and sciences. My high school counselor suggested I apply. Dad was proud but also worried. It was 1985, things were different for women in the military then." As Margaret spoke, the years seemed to fall away. She described her time at the Naval Academy, the challenges, the triumphs, the constant pressure to prove herself in a predominantly male environment. After commissioning, she had initially served as an intelligence officer, but her aptitude for languages and physical capabilities had drawn attention. In 1991, after the Gulf War, there was a small, classified program assessing how women might function in special operations roles, she explained. "On paper, we were intelligence support personnel. In reality, we were being trained and tested for much more direct roles." Michael leaned forward, fascinated. "How many of you were there?" "Initially 12. By the time we deployed to Somalia, 8. We worked in 4 two-person teams, paired with male operators. My partner was a staff sergeant named David Reynolds." She paused, a shadow crossing her face at the mention of Reynolds' name. Michael noticed but didn't interrupt. "When the task force deployed to Mogadishu in 1993, our role was intelligence gathering in the city. We spoke the language, could move more freely in certain areas. When the operation to capture Aided's lieutenants went wrong on October 3rd, everything changed." Margaret's voice grew quieter as she described how her team had been separated from the main force, finding themselves with a group of wounded Rangers cut off from extraction. Reynolds was shot helping move one of the wounded to cover. The Rangers' lieutenant was already dead. As the ranking officer still capable of command, I took charge. She stared at her hands as she spoke. "We held our position through the night, treating the wounded as best we could with limited supplies. By morning, we knew we had to move or we'd be overrun. Michael sat motionless, hardly breathing as his mother described guiding the group through back alleys, using her language skills to get information from local civilians sympathetic to the American forces. They had fought their way to a secondary extraction point where General Harrington, then Captain Harrington, had led a quick reaction force to bring them out. "That's when I was hit," Margaret said, her hand again finding the scar near her collarbone. "It wasn't serious compared to what others suffered. Reynolds didn't make it. 3 of the Rangers we were protecting died before we reached extraction. 5 others survived because we got them out." "And you received the Silver Star," Michael said softly. Margaret nodded. The citation was carefully worded. Women weren't supposed to be in direct combat. The program we were part of wasn't officially acknowledged. The medal recognized the action without detailing the full circumstances. "After Somalia," Michael prompted when she fell silent. "I finished my commitment. The program was quietly disbanded after Somalia. The political climate wasn't ready for women in special operations. I was offered a regular intelligence officer position, but I'd seen enough." Margaret's eyes met her son's. "I was diagnosed with what they now call PTSD, though we didn't use that term much then. I needed something different." She explained how she'd used her GI Bill to get a master's degree in library science, seeking the peace of academia after the chaos of combat. How she'd met Richard Wilson, a kind high school history teacher who loved books as much as she did, who had helped her build a new life far from her military past. "Dad knew about all this?" Michael asked. "Yes, he was the only one who knew the full story. When he proposed, I told him everything. I also told him I wanted to leave that life behind completely. He understood." Margaret smiled sadly. "He used to say he was in awe of what I'd done, but in love with who I'd become." "And when he died, you still didn't think about telling me?" Margaret looked down. "By then, it had been so long. You were 18, getting ready for college. I didn't know how to suddenly tell you your mother had once been someone completely different. When I told you I wanted to join the Marines after college, you didn't try to talk me out of it," Michael observed. "Most mothers would have." "I understood the calling," Margaret replied simply. "And despite everything, I still believe in what the Corps stands for. I couldn't deny you the chance to discover that for yourself." Michael was quiet for a moment. "At OCS, whenever I struggled, I would think about how disappointed you'd be if I quit. I never imagined I was also upholding your legacy." "You weren't, you were creating your own." Margaret reached across the table to take her son's hand. "That's why I didn't tell you. Your accomplishments are yours, not reflections of mine." "But all those times I rambled about Marine Corps history, about Somalia, about—" Michael stopped abruptly. "Oh God, I once explained to you what a Silver Star was, my own mother who had earned one." Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "You were 16 and had just read Black Hawk Down. Your enthusiasm was wonderful to see. You must have thought I was so naive." "I thought you were curious and passionate, just like your father." She squeezed his hand. "Michael, I never wanted my past to overshadow your present. You earned your commission today on your own merits. Nothing changes that." As the evening deepened into night, they continued talking. Margaret shared stories she had kept buried for decades, some humorous, some poignant, some painful. Michael listened, occasionally asking questions, gradually coming to see his mother in a completely new light. "Do you ever miss it?" he finally asked. "The Corps, the mission, the purpose." Margaret considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, not the danger or the loss, but the clarity of purpose, the bond with your team. Those things are hard to find in civilian life." "Is that why you became so involved in community service back home? The library board, the Veterans Reading Program, the Disaster Relief Committee?" Margaret looked surprised. "I never thought of it that way, but perhaps, after your father died, those activities gave me purpose." She smiled slightly. "Though I doubt organizing the library's annual book sale compares to leading a team behind enemy lines." "I don't know," Michael said with a small grin. "I've seen Mrs. Henderson when someone messes up her romance novel section. She's scarier than any drill instructor." They both laughed, breaking some of the tension that had built throughout the evening. Later, as they prepared for bed, Michael watched his mother. This woman he thought he had known completely but was now seeing anew. "Mom," he said as she was turning down the covers, "I'm proud of you, not just for what you did back then, but for who you've been for me my whole life." Margaret's eyes glistened. Thank you, Michael. That means more than any medal ever could. As she lay in the darkness later, listening to her son's steady breathing from the other bed, Margaret felt a weight lifting that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For decades, she had compartmentalized her life. Margaret Foster, the Marine, locked away so Margaret Wilson, the mother, could exist without complications. Now, for the first time, she felt those two parts of herself beginning to reconcile. Her son knew the truth, and instead of disappointment or confusion, he had shown pride and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new adjustments to their relationship. There would be more questions, more stories to share. But tonight, Margaret felt more complete than she had in 30 years, not just a mother watching her son graduate, but a Marine recognizing the continuation of a legacy she had thought forgotten. The next morning brought a surprise. As Margaret and Michael ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, a text message arrived on Michael's phone. "It's from the Commandant's aide," he said, looking up from the screen with surprise. "General Harrington is inviting us to tour the National Museum of the Marine Corps before we head home. He's offering to meet us there personally." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "That's unexpected." "Do you want to go?" Michael asked, studying her reaction. Margaret considered for a moment. For years, she had deliberately avoided military museums and memorials, fearing they would stir memories she preferred to keep settled. But now, with her past revealed to Michael, perhaps it was time to face those memories directly. Yes, she decided, let's go. 2 hours later, they arrived at the distinctive building whose design evoked the famous image of Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. General Harrington was waiting for them in the lobby, dressed in civilian clothes rather than uniform, a considerate choice that would allow them to tour without drawing attention. "Mrs. Wilson, Lieutenant Wilson, thank you for coming," he greeted them warmly. "I thought this might be a meaningful way for you both to connect with the Corps history, including parts that aren't widely known." As they walked through the museum's extensive galleries, General Harrington proved to be a knowledgeable guide, offering insights and personal anecdotes about various exhibits. Margaret found herself increasingly comfortable, occasionally adding her own observations about equipment or tactics she had once used. In the gallery covering operations in the 1990s, they paused before a small display about Somalia. Most of the exhibit focused on the well-documented Battle of Mogadishu, but in a corner was a modest photograph showing a mixed group of Marines and Army personnel before a deployment. "Third row, second from right," the general said quietly to Michael. Michael leaned closer, then caught his breath. There, barely recognizable in desert camouflage with her hair tucked under a cap, was a younger version of his mother. "That's the only public photograph that includes members of your mother's program," General Harrington explained. "The caption simply identifies them as intelligence support personnel." Margaret stared at the photograph, memories flooding back. "Reynolds is there, front row," she said softly. "And Captain Martinez, our command liaison. I hadn't seen this picture in years." "Few people who visit here understand the significance of this photo," the general said. "But those of us who know recognize it as documentation of groundbreaking steps toward what we now take for granted, women serving in all combat roles, including special operations." As they continued through the museum, they eventually reached a quiet corridor that housed small exhibits about classified or less-known operations. General Harrington led them to a display case containing various items from operations in Somalia. "This was added last year," he explained, pointing to a tattered field medical kit. "It belonged to a corpsman who saved numerous lives during the operations in Mogadishu." Next to it was a weathered compass with a crack across its face. Margaret stopped abruptly, staring at it. "That's," she began, then fell silent. "Yes," the general confirmed. "Your compass. It was among the items recovered after the extraction. When the museum curators were assembling this exhibit, I suggested its inclusion. The description merely states it was used by intelligence personnel to navigate through Mogadishu during rescue operations." Margaret's hand moved toward the glass, stopping just short of touching it. "I thought it was lost. It was my father's from Vietnam." Michael looked from the compass to his mother, a new understanding dawning. "You navigated your team through a hostile city with that." "GPS wasn't what it is today," Margaret said simply. "Sometimes old methods are the most reliable." As they completed their tour, General Harrington led them to a private room where lunch had been arranged. As they ate, the conversation turned to Michael's upcoming training at the basic school and his future in the Corps. "Have you considered your preferred occupational specialty, Lieutenant?" the general asked. "Intelligence, sir," Michael replied, "though I'm keeping an open mind." Margaret looked at her son with surprise. "You never mentioned intelligence before. You've always talked about infantry or aviation." Michael shrugged slightly. "Recent developments have made me reconsider my options." Before Margaret could respond, the door opened and an aide entered, carrying a polished wooden box. He placed it on the table and departed without a word. General Harrington opened the box and removed a framed citation and a medal, the distinctive five-pointed star suspended from a blue and white ribbon. "Margaret Foster Wilson," he said formally, "30 years ago you were awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The full circumstances of your heroism remained classified, the presentation was done quietly, and the citation was worded to obscure the true nature of your actions." He placed the medal and citation on the table before her. "This is a replica of your Silver Star, with a new citation that more accurately reflects your actions, declassified to the extent possible after all these years. While we cannot publicly change the official record, I wanted you, and your son, to have the true account of what you accomplished." Margaret stared at the medal, emotions washing over her face. "General, this isn't necessary." "With respect, ma'am, it is," he replied, the formal address again carrying that weight of recognition. "Not just for you, but for the Corps. Too many women who served with distinction have had their contributions minimized or hidden. It's time to correct that, even if only in small, personal ways." Michael picked up the citation and read it silently, his expression growing more awed with each line. When he finished, he looked at his mother with new respect. "Mom, this says you personally treated 3 wounded Rangers while under fire, then carried one of them during the extraction movement." He paused. "You told me last night you weren't a hero." "I did what was necessary," Margaret said softly. "We all did." "Lieutenant Wilson," General Harrington said, "when you complete the basic school, you'll begin a career that may take you anywhere in the world, into circumstances you cannot predict. Should you find yourself in a situation where the right path isn't clear, remember that you come from a tradition of moral courage as well as physical bravery." As lunch concluded, they prepared to depart. In the museum's lobby, General Harrington shook Michael's hand firmly. "Lieutenant, I look forward to following your career. The Corps is fortunate to have another Wilson serving." Then he turned to Margaret. For a moment, the general seemed to debate with himself, then he straightened to attention and rendered a perfect salute. "Ma'am," he said with quiet respect, "it has been an honor." Margaret hesitated only briefly before returning the salute with a precision that belied the decades since she'd last performed the gesture. "The honor is mine, General," she replied. As they walked to their car, Michael glanced at his mother. "You know, you still stand like a Marine. I just never recognized it before." Margaret smiled slightly. "Some habits never fade completely." "Will you come to my graduation from the basic school, in your old uniform?" Margaret considered the question. "I'm not sure the uniform would still fit," she said wryly. "But yes, I'll be there, no more hiding." As they drove away from Quantico, Margaret felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for 30 years. She had come to the base as Michael's mother, intending to watch quietly and proudly as he began his Marine Corps journey. She was leaving as both his mother and a recognized Marine in her own right. The compass in the museum display case had once guided her through the dangerous streets of Mogadishu. Now, another kind of compass was guiding her back to a part of herself she had too long denied, not to replace who she had become, but to make her more complete. She glanced at the Silver Star citation on the seat between them. She had once set aside the medal, unable to reconcile the recognition with the losses that accompanied it. Now, she saw it differently, not just as a symbol of one difficult day in Somalia, but as part of a legacy that connected her to her son in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Michael," she said as they merged onto the highway, "when we get home, there's a trunk in the attic I'd like to show you. It contains some things from my service years, photos, letters, mementos." "I'd like that," he replied with a smile. "And I think I'd like to start coming to the veterans' events at the library, not just as the organizer, but as a participant." Michael nodded, understanding the significance of this shift. The VFW post has been trying to get you to attend their Memorial Day ceremony for years. Yes, well, perhaps it's time I accepted their invitation. Margaret's hands were steady on the steering wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead. I've been Margaret Wilson, librarian and mother, for so long that I almost forgot Margaret Foster existed. But she's part of me too, and it seems she has something to contribute after all. As the miles passed, Margaret felt herself changing, not becoming someone new, but becoming more fully herself. She had only come to watch her son graduate, to be the proud mother in the audience. But when the Commandant had called her ma'am, in that particular way that acknowledged her service and sacrifice, he had helped her reclaim a part of herself she had long set aside. She was still Michael's mother. She was still the librarian from Cedar Falls. But she was also Lieutenant Margaret Foster, Silver Star recipient. And for the first time in decades, she was comfortable being all of those people at once. "Mom," Michael said as they drove past a sign welcoming them to Virginia. "Yes. I'm glad the Commandant recognized you yesterday. I'm glad I know the truth now." Margaret smiled, her eyes still on the road ahead. "So am I, Michael, so am I."